Israel is an apartheid state. It is annexing the West Bank via an illegal occupation, which it is illegally using to steal and colonise land. And prior to 7th October 2023, as per international law, Gaza was under Israeli occupation because Israel in practice exercised full control over it thanks to the siege, which itself is the longest siege in modern times. I'm not reading out my opinion here. I'm just reading out to you the law. I'm reading out what the International Court of Justice, the highest court on earth, has decreed to be international law. At the end of 2022, the General Assembly of the UN voted to ask the ICJ to set out its position on the legality of Israel's 57-year-long occupation, the longest belligerent occupation of modern times. The legal judgment is absolutely devastating, with near unanimity from the judges involved in many of the opinions. To be clear, this is an advisory opinion, so Israel's cheerleaders will jump on the fact that this is not a legally binding ruling. But the point is, this reflects how the world's top court understands international law. What it says here, with the overwhelming approval of the world's top judges, should be understood as international law. Now, according to the ICJ, Israel violates international law through its occupation of Palestinian land in multiple ways. It diverts resources to settlers and Israeli citizens, defying the responsibility it has as the occupier under international law to provide sufficient resources to the occupied population and for the Palestinian people to have permanent sovereignty over their natural resources. It finds Israel is breaking international law by expanding Israeli law into the occupied territories, not least East Jerusalem and the settlements of the West Bank. It finds Israel is depriving the local Palestinian population of the means of subsistence, and that's causing their unwilling departure. This constitutes illegal, forcible transfer of people. Now let's listen to the call on the forcible transfer of the protected population.
Turning next to the question of the extension of Israeli law to the occupied Palestinian territory. The court recalls that under Article 43 of the Hague Regulations, the occupying power must in principle respect the law in force in the occupied territory unless absolutely prevented from doing so. In principle, then, the law of occupation does not breach the prohibition of forcible transfer and therefore are not covered by the exception set out in the second paragraph of Article 49. The court considers that Israel's policies and practices, including its forcible evictions, extensive house demolitions, and restrictions on residence and movement, often leave little choice to members of the Palestinian population living in Area C, but to leave their area of residence. The nature of Israel's acts, including the fact that Israel frequently confiscates land following the demolition of Palestinian property for reallocation to Israeli settlements, indicates that its measures are not temporary in character and therefore cannot be considered as permissible evacuations under the 4th Geneva Convention. In the court view, Israel's policies and practices are contrary to the prohibition of forcible transfer of the protected population under Article 49, paragraph 1 of the 4th Geneva Convention.
The court notes that Israel's settlement program leads to violence from settlers, and given Israel's systematic failure to either prevent or punish such violence, as well as the excessive use of force by the Israeli state against the Palestinians, that there is a coercive environment which Palestinians suffer from, violating international law. Its settlements of the West Bank are maintained and established in violation of international law. It finds Israel guilty of annexation, that is the forcible acquisition by the occupying power of the territories that it occupied, including intent to exercise permanent control of the territory. It treats occupied East Jerusalem as its sovereign capital and has created an inhospitable environment for Palestinians there, treating them as foreigners. Let's hear the call on the systematic discrimination suffered by the Palestinians at the hands of the Israeli state.
The court concludes from the evidence presented to it and on the basis of its analysis that a broad array of legislation adopted and measures taken by Israel in its capacity as an occupying power treat Palestinians differently on grounds specified by international law. The court notes that this differentiation of treatment cannot be justified with reference to reasonable and objective criteria, nor to a legitimate public aim. Accordingly, the Court is of the view that the regime of comprehensive restrictions imposed by Israel on Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory constitutes systematic discrimination based on inter-area, race, religion, or ethnic origin in violation of Article 2, Paragraph 1 and 26 of the ICCPR, Article 2, Paragraph 2 of the ICESCR, and Article 2 of CERD.
Now, this point about discrimination needs a word to describe it. Let's listen further.
A number of participants have argued that Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory amount to segregation or apartheid in breach of Article 3 of CERD. Article 3 of CERD provides as follows, I quote, "States parties particularly condemn racial segregation and apartheid and undertake to prevent, prohibit, and eradicate all practices of this nature in territories under their jurisdiction." This provision refers to two particularly severe forms of racial discrimination, racial segregation, and apartheid. The Court observed that Israel's legislation and measures imposed and serve to maintain a near complete separation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem between the settler and Palestinian communities. For this reason, the Court considered that Israel's legislation and measures constitute a breach of Article 3 of CERD. Having found that Israel's settlement policy, its acts of annexation, and its related discriminatory legislation and measures are in breach of international law.
There you have it. The Court considers that Israeli legislation and measures constitute a breach of Article 3 of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Article 3 specifically condemns, and I quote, "racial segregation and apartheid, and undertake to prevent, prohibit, and eradicate all practices of this nature in territories under their jurisdiction." In other words, Israel is guilty of the crime of apartheid. It is an apartheid state. That has, of course, already been found by the likes of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem. Now, the Court goes on to say that Israel is not entitled to sovereignty in any part of the occupied Palestinian territories on account of its occupation, nor can security concerns override the prohibition on acquisition of territory by force. Its presence in the occupied Palestinian territories is unlawful, and it has a legal obligation to bring an end to the occupation as rapidly as possible. It must cease all new settlement activities, repeal all laws that create discrimination and measures aimed at modifying the demographics of the territory it occupies, and it must offer full reparations, including the returning of land, assets, cultural property it has taken unlawfully, as well as evacuating all settlers and allowing the return of the Palestinian people rightfully to where they belong. If that restitution is judged impossible, then Israel must offer full compensation to those who have suffered damage. These judgments had overwhelming support from judges. By 11-4, they ruled that Israel's presence in the occupied territory was unlawful. The same number declared that it must end the occupation. By 14-1, they found that settlers must be evacuated, and by the same number that reparations must be made. Crucially too, the ICJ also found that the UN Security Council, its General Assembly, and all states have an obligation not to recognise the occupation as legal, nor render aid or assistance towards maintaining Israel's presence in the occupied territories. By 12-3, they found all states have an obligation to not recognise the occupation as legal. And again, by the same number, that all international organisations must not recognise the occupation as legal, and the same number that the UN General Assembly and Security Council must bring forward precise next steps to bring an end to Israel's unlawful occupation of Palestine. In other words, it is a violation of international law to assist this occupation. Our governments are directly facilitating an egregious violation of the law in their behaviour. Let's listen to British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, who previously tried to wash his hands of making any judgments on what Israel is doing because it's not the role of politicians to adjudicate on international law.
As to whether each and every act is in accordance with the law, well, that will have to be adjudicated in due course. I think it's unwise for politicians to stand on stages like this or to sit in television studios and pronounce day by day which acts may or may not be in accordance with international law. I think it's not the role of politicians.
Well, this man is a lawyer, a former human rights lawyer, no less, who brought a case on behalf of Croatia, the state of Croatia, at the ICJ. So what's his excuse? He must accept what the court has overwhelmingly concluded and act on it. Where is he? Where's his statement? Why is he not saying anything? Why are journalists not asking him about it? Just goes to show the media in Britain and in many other states is fundamentally unserious. This is the sorts of questions they should be asking him on international issues. It's not the only thing they should be asking about before people set up a false dichotomy. It's not either or. But clearly, what's going on in Gaza, Israel, Palestine, is of immense global significance. British history has quite a lot to do with it. I know we don't talk about history in those terms. We just pretend it didn't happen. But it did. And the consequences are being felt today in heinous ways. Now, this must mean ending all arms sales to Israel. It means supporting the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court's request for arrest warrants. It means imposing sanctions on Israel. Now, predictably, Israeli politicians have denounced the ICJ as anti-Semitic. Their view is anyone and everything which does not justify Israeli crimes is anti-Semitic. It's not just a deranged, grotesque mere, it's utterly dangerous because it devalues the meaning of the word anti-Semitic and anti-Semitism, when anti-Jewish hatred is real and it's growing. It's a terrible evil which must be fought. Another point, many prominent Labour politicians and Liberal commentators style themselves as great believers in such liberal precepts as the rule of law, as respect for international law. Many of them will damn say Russia on that count. Well, that's easy to do, isn't it? It's the easiest thing in the world to do. It requires no moral courage. Russia, after all, is an official enemy, and there's a consensus here from the world of politics to media on the behaviour of the Russian state. But when it comes to a Western ally, and indeed the complicity of our own government in outrageous violations of international law, well, virtual silence. This exposes these people for who and what they are. Hypocrites with no discernible moral compass whatsoever. Well, those who champion the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement can say with full accuracy that they are acting to protect international law. There are so many who have shown themselves to be on the wrong side of history. Well, in my view, the verdict of history will be damning indeed. Please leave your thoughts. Please leave your comments, as ever. Always love reading through your comments, even the abusive ones. So you see, we've got a great community here, I feel. I've learned a lot from your comments. Do press like, subscribe, press like, good for the algorithm. Keep the show on the road, patreon.com/84. Listen to the podcast. I'll speak to you soon.